The ADA. What is it? How is it passed? And how does it affect Americans today? The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which became a law in 1990 when President George Bush signed the bill. The supporters of this bill brought up the Equal Protection Clause in Amendment 14 of the Constitution, which states that the government shall not deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. There are four main goals of the ADA, listed by John R. Vaughan as equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. These goals helped to guide the National Council on Disability in the creation of the original draft of the bill. The ADA was written to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in many different areas. It is divided into 5 titles: employment, state and local government, public accommodations, telecommunications, and miscellaneous provisions. The employment section was written to give people with disabilities an equal opportunity for employment. Employers must provide reasonable accommodations for employees or applicants. This title is enforced by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The state and local government section prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in any programs and applies to all state and local governments. This title is regulated and enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice. The public accommodations section outlines minimum accessibility alterations that private places of public accommodation must make. This title applies to places such as hotels, restaurants, doctors' offices, sports stadiums, and movie theaters. This title is also regulated and enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice. The telecommunications section requires phone and internet companies to accommodate people with hearing and speech disabilities, and that federally funded public service announcements have closed captioning. This title is regulated by the Federal Communication Commission. The miscellaneous provision section talks about the ADA's relationship with other laws, illegal use of drugs, and attorney's fees, among other topics. How is the ADA passed? What prompted its creation? 19%, nearly 1 in 5, 56.7 million. These are all numbers that represent the estimated number of Americans that have a disability, yet this issue had not been addressed until after World War I. Before this, disabled people were stigmatized and separated from the rest of society. Then, World War I veterans expected that the U.S. government would help rehabilitate them, which led to advancements in technology and government assistance. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first president to have a disability, and he greatly advocated for the rehabilitation of people with disabilities, but they were still viewed as abnormal and shameful. In the 1940s and 50s, World War II veterans placed more and more pressure on the government to provide rehabilitation and vocational training, which made the issue more visible to the citizens who were concerned with the veterans' long-term welfare. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement started, and the disability rights activists joined forces with other minority groups to demand equality. In the 1970s, they began to lobby Congress and led marches to include people with disabilities in the Rehabilitation Act, which passed in 1973 and gave people with disabilities their first protection by law. In 1988, the National Council on Disability, or NCD, drafted the first version of the Americans with Disabilities Act and introduced it in the Senate. The NCD is responsible for advising the President and Congress on issues involving disabled people. This bill did not recommend for funding increases, which helped it to be passed through Congress more quickly. Two major supporters of this bill in Congress were Senator Robert Dole from Kansas, who lost the use of his right arm during World War II, and Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa, whose brother had hearing loss. In Congress, most people supported the idea of the bill and wanted it to get passed, but that took a significant amount of time because several provisions of the bill were debated over. Eventually, President Bush endorsed the bill, which helped it to pass. Between the introduction of the bill and the signing was 2 years. Any bill must be introduced into both the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the House of Representatives, it was introduced by Representative Tony Colho from California on May 9, 1989. It was then passed by the House later on that month. In the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Tom Harkin, also on May 9, 1989. It was also passed in the Senate. Since slightly different versions of the bill passed in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, a joint committee was formed to create one version of the bill, which then had to be reapproved by the House and the Senate. It was approved and sent to the President to be signed or vetoed. In this case, it was signed and officially became law. Since the ADA was signed in 1990 by President George Bush, it has had a significant impact on people in America. Americans with disabilities have greater access to goods and services from businesses, state and local governments, and their local communities. Employees are less likely to be terminated due to their disabilities, and public transit systems have made significant progress in becoming more accessible. States do not like this law because it shifts the balance of power toward the federal government. The ADA is also an unfunded mandate, which means that they are being forced to do something without being given the money to do so, making it even more unpopular among states. From researching the passage of the ADA, I learned the importance of the law and how there are many things that I have just assumed had always been there, such as ramps, that without this law would not exist. I also got a deeper insight as to how the bill passes through the legislative branch to become a law. This law tells us that when the government has a common goal, it can get things done.